roughly 120 kilometers north of Lashio in Burma. American ground forces found themselves locked in fierce fighting with Japanese troops over control of a section of the old Burma Road, an overland artery that had become one of the most vital supply lines for the Allied forces engaged in the China-Burma-India theater. For the Allies, the Burma Road was more than just a rugged highway through jungle and mountains. It represented the lifeline that connected their bases in India with the Chinese forces resisting Japanese expansion. Without it, the struggle to keep China supplied with arms, food, and fuel would become nearly impossible. Stationed deep in the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, a small American formation known as Detachment 101 operated between 1942 and mid-1945. Carrying out an unrelenting campaign of sabotage, ambushes, and harassment against Japanese forces. Although few in number, these Americans and their native allies played a decisive role in undermining Japanese control in Burma, and their relentless activities contributed significantly to the eventual Japanese retreat. When the enemy was finally compelled to relinquish Burma, their broader plan of pushing into India was effectively shattered, securing the subcontinent from an invasion that had once seemed within reach. Detachment 101, composed of a handful of American personnel under the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, was tasked with the dangerous mission of training, arming, and leading local guerrilla groups. These irregular fighters proved invaluable in disrupting Japanese communications, destroying supply routes, and spreading confusion throughout enemy ranks. Their actions denied the Japanese the full use of Burma as a strategic base of operations at a time when Tokyo sought to establish the country as a cornerstone for its dominance in Southeast Asia. The story of these guerrillas illustrates the wider struggle over Burma, a land that became the centerpiece of one of the hardest-fought campaigns of the Second World War. The road to this conflict began with the Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In the months that followed, Japan launched a lightning-fast series of offensives across Asia and the Pacific, capturing the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Borneo, and Burma, along with dozens of islands scattered throughout the South and Central Pacific. These rapid advances often encountered only weak resistance, and within 5 months of the initial attack, Japan had built a position strong enough to threaten both India and Australia. By the spring of 1942, Burma was firmly in Japanese hands, and its most important cities, Rangoon and Mandalay, fell quickly. British and Indian forces that managed to escape retreated into India, and the Chinese army, under General Joseph Stilwell, was forced into a difficult withdrawal. With Stilwell himself barely avoiding capture by fast-moving Japanese columns, the Japanese advance was aided by segments of the Burmese population who, weary of centuries of foreign domination under successive dynasties and colonial powers, sought an opportunity for independence. These locals lent assistance in sabotage, ambushes, and intelligence gathering, believing Japanese promises of Asia for Asians, yet their hopes were soon betrayed. Rather than granting self-rule, the occupiers imposed harsher political, economic, and social control than the British ever had, leaving Burma under even greater oppression. What had initially seemed like liberation became another chapter of exploitation. Burma's strategic value went far beyond its borders. The Burma Road, which wound across the rugged northern highlands, was essential for getting supplies from Allied depots in India into China, where resistance to Japan was still holding strong. Once Burma was lost, the Allies had no choice but to supply China by air, flying perilous missions over the towering Himalayas. This hazardous route, known as the Hump, was extremely costly, dangerous, and inefficient. Yet it remained the only option for keeping China in the war. Moreover, with Burma in their grasp, the Japanese had a potential springboard for launching an invasion of India itself, which would have opened yet another devastating front for the Allies to contend with. These looming dangers made the reconquest of Burma not merely desirable but absolutely essential for the Allied war effort in Southeast Asia. In Washington, American leaders realized that conventional military power alone would not be enough to drive the Japanese from Burma and the territories they had seized. After long consideration, planners concluded that covert operations, espionage, sabotage, and subversion were necessary to weaken Japanese control from within. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, impressed by the effectiveness of Britain's Special Operations Executive, sought to create a comparable American agency. He turned to William J. Wild Bill Donovan, a trusted associate from his Columbia Law School days, to organize such an effort. Donovan was no stranger to bold undertakings. A successful Wall Street lawyer and former Assistant Attorney General, he had distinguished himself in the First World War as the commander of the famed 60th Regiment of the Rainbow Division. His valor had earned him the nation's highest military honors, placing him alongside General Douglas MacArthur as one of only 2 Americans to receive the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Distinguished Service Medal. The organization Donovan established began as the Office of the Coordinator of Information, but was soon restructured and renamed the Office of Strategic Services. or OSS. This new body became the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency and was tasked with conducting the kind of shadow war Roosevelt believed necessary to erode Japanese strength from behind enemy lines. Detachment 101 in Burma was one of its most effective arms, setting the stage for how intelligence, irregular warfare, and guerrilla movements could shape the course of entire campaigns. Through their tireless and often unseen efforts, these operatives proved that a small force, properly directed, could tilt the balance in one of the most crucial regions of the global war. There is little question that Burma offered fertile ground for an Allied campaign of sabotage and subversion. Its northern reaches were cloaked in dense jungle that provided near-perfect cover for guerrilla operations. Shortly after Stilwell took command, Donovan opened talks with him to sketch out such a plan. Because the army lacked a ready-made force for this kind of work, it was necessary to build specialist teams from the ground up. Stillwell identified a promising officer in the 35th Infantry Regiment, Captain Ayer, who led a company based in Hawaii and judged him fit to head the proposed missions. Ayer, a physically imposing man, reported to stand over 6 feet 2 and weigh more than 250 pounds and trained in jiu-jitsu, wasted no time assembling a nucleus of officers and sergeants he believed could form an effective operational cadre. After traveling to Washington, D.C., the new mission chief conferred with General Donovan and listened to Donovan's rather indistinct concepts for organizing and training the unit. Ayer then set up a series of training sites across Maryland. The first of these, roughly 70 miles from the capital, occupied land that later became the presidential retreat known as Camp David. Intensive preparation for what was officially termed OSS Detachment 101 began in early April 1942 with an initial complement of 21 men, a designation chosen to suggest an established long-standing formation. William Apai, who ultimately succeeded Ayer in command of Detachment 101, recalled in his memoirs that Peters followed Ayer as commander. Curriculum for the detachment was broad and highly specialized. Instruction in the use of high explosives, cryptographic techniques, search and rescue procedures, and a wide array of clandestine skills needed for operations behind enemy lines. Thorough training in unarmed combat prepared men for close encounters. Exercises were deliberately harsh and destructive to mirror the brutal reality of facing the enemy. Because capture often meant torture or execution, agents were issued lethal capsules so they could avoid falling into enemy hands. Parachute work was a core element of the program. Operators were expected to insert by air into hostile territory, and trainees also practiced clandestine beach landings in small boats launched from submarines. Trainers strove to make every exercise as realistic as possible. By late 1943, a Pacific-oriented course was established on Catalina Island. The OSS opened a camp at Toyon Bay, using a former boys' school whose seclusion and difficult access made it ideal for covert training. It quickly became apparent that soldiers bound for the China-Burma theater had only a short period in which to be readied. In late May 1942, the newly formed team departed for Asia aboard a slow freighter that carried the scant equipment Detachment 101 had managed to assemble on short notice. The unit reached Kinau, part of Pakistan, on July 4, 1942, then crossed India to Natsira in Assam, near the Burma frontier. The Natsira area contained several airfields run by the U.S. Air Transport Command that handled supply flights to China. The Americans soon established contact with local British authorities who had detailed knowledge of Burma and Japanese activity there, and they began instruction in demolition techniques. Detachment 101, simultaneously, set about teaching techniques for demolishing the kinds of installations and equipment that kept Japanese operations running. And as the Americans trained their first classes, largely British and Anglo-Burmese volunteers, they found themselves learning almost as much from the locals as they taught them. These early recruits brought far greater familiarity with Burmese people and terrain than the newcomers, and it quickly became clear that long-term success would hinge on securing broad native support. Much of Japan's early advantage in Burma had stemmed from assistance by segments of the local population who, hoping for liberation from colonial rule, aided the invaders' fifth column activities. Those hopes were soon dashed by harsher occupation policies, leaving many Burmese disillusioned. Burma's population spoke many tongues and included distinct ethnic groups. The hill peoples of the north differed sharply from the farming communities of the plains, and tribes such as the Karens, Shans, Chins, and especially the Kachin lived in remote forest settlements near the frontier and were generally more warlike. Before the war, most locally raised forces officered by the British came from these hill communities, and their skill in jungle fighting made them prime candidates for guerrilla bands. So the United States moved quickly to recruit them. Detachment 101's plan for the campaign in Burma emphasized three main tasks: the destruction of opportunistic targets, bridges, rail lines, and mines that sustained Japanese logistics, the ambushing and observation of enemy troops wherever possible, and the recovery of downed Allied airmen. Small teams were parachuted into remote jungle close to their objectives and usually included one or more local Kachin who acted as guides, saboteurs, and translators when operations brought units among their own villages. Guerrilla actions relied on sudden strikes followed by rapid withdrawal, no attempt to seize and hold ground, and the Kachin proved exceptionally adept at this kind of warfare. The jungle itself provided excellent concealment for hit-and-run raids. Among the improvised weapons used were pungus to foot, bamboo stakes sharpened over fire until razor-like bricks to Kachin hit along jungle tracks and which inflicted serious wounds on unsuspecting Japanese patrols. For inserting teams and moving men and materiel, the Air Transport Command supplied C-87 cargo aircraft, conversions of the B-24 Liberator modified to permit parachute exits. These planes also dropped supplies and picked up raiding parties whenever possible, though on occasions when air extraction was impossible, the detachments had to trek out on foot. General Stilwell's effort to retake Burma depended on keeping open a crucial road and rail connection between Calcutta and the Chinese forces in the field, since loss of those lines would force resupply by air and sharply reduce Chinese effectiveness. To that end, Detachment 101 focused on ambushing isolated Japanese units, severing supply routes, and radioing reports of troop movements. Myochina, the principal Japanese strongpoint in northern Burma, became the focus of Stilwell's concerted offensive begun in April, and Japanese aircraft based there repeatedly harassed the Allied routes that linked land approaches to the Burma Road, which remained the key overland supply artery throughout the campaign. The Chinese divisions holding positions in eastern Burma and beyond were integrated into General Joseph Stilwell's three-pronged campaign, a large-scale plan that combined several very different but complementary fighting groups. Among them were around 3,000 freshly recruited American soldiers who volunteered for hazardous jungle combat and came to be known as Merrill Marauders, a diverse but battle-tested British-led contingent called the Chindits, made up of British troops alongside Gurkhas, Nigerians, Chinese, and Burmese fighters, and two Chinese divisions, the 22nd and the 38th. The Chindits themselves were a mosaic of soldiers from Burma, China, and the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, in India, American officers directly under Stilwell had been tasked with training Chinese forces, providing them with the necessary preparation for the kind of grueling warfare that lay ahead. Once plans were finalized, Stilwell issued clear instructions. The Chinese would mount a direct attack against the main Japanese stronghold. The Americans would maneuver from the east and threaten the Japanese right flank, and the Chindits advancing westward from India would cut deep into the rear of the Japanese positions and create disruption behind their defensive lines, while these main Allied forces pressed toward the enemy. Detachment 101 carried out continuous operations of sabotage. They disrupted enemy communications, sabotaged supply chains, and guided Allied troops through the hostile terrain, ensuring the advance did not lose momentum. By May 17th, the Allies seized Myochina's critical airfield, a victory that at first appeared decisive. But complications soon followed. Stilwell delegated the final capture of the city to Chinese battalions, yet those units were relatively inexperienced and poorly coordinated. In the chaos of battle, they mistakenly fired upon each other, inflicting severe casualties in a tragic case of friendly fire and forcing them to fall back. This gave the Japanese a brief window to recover, reinforce their positions, and prolong the fight for control. Despite this setback, Allied forces eventually expelled the Japanese from Myochina in August, driving them into the southern mountain ranges of Burma. The Japanese air threat to the Leda Road and Burma Road was effectively neutralized with this victory. As the Japanese retreated, Detachment 101 continued to harass them relentlessly, ensuring their retreat was costly. Though only fragments of their troops managed to regroup at Bima, yet the Allied spearhead itself suffered terribly. Merrill Marauders, the Chindits, and their Chinese allies endured not only combat losses but also the crushing effects of tropical disease, starvation, and exhaustion. By the time they were relieved, the Marauders were so devastated they could no longer function as a unit. The Chindits, suffering equally as they pushed farther south, met a similar fate. Both formations also lost their leaders. General Frank Merrill, whose name had been given to his Marauders, was stricken with 3 heart attacks during the campaign and had to be replaced. While Brigadier Ord Wingate, the bold and often flamboyant commander of the Chindits, died in a plane crash on March 24, 1944. For the Japanese, Myochina marked their first major defeat in Burma. the beginning of a chain of setbacks from which they would not recover. They now faced an Allied force that grew stronger each month, well supplied and firmly in control of the skies, while their own troops dwindled with no replacements and their supply routes were cut and harassed by Chechen guerrillas directed by Detachment 101. As the campaign advanced, the OSS broadened its reach by expanding the training of Burmese recruits. Many of these men, including Shans and other lowland groups who had once sided with the Japanese, switched allegiance and joined the guerrillas. By the final months of the conflict, Detachment 101 commanded a vast network of local fighters, numbering in the thousands. Alongside direct military operations, the detachment waged psychological warfare. They circulated forged Japanese-language leaflets crafted to look like official orders from Tokyo, demanding that enemy troops surrender. These pamphlets undermined morale among already weary Japanese soldiers and hastened their disintegration. Despite stubborn resistance, the Japanese steadily lost strongholds, and key cities such as Mandalay and Rangoon were eventually liberated. By July 1945, Washington decided to wind down OSS activities in Burma, as the mission had fulfilled its purpose. The record of Detachment 101's achievements was extraordinary. At its peak strength, it included only 689 Americans, 131 officers, and 558 enlisted men, yet it managed to train more than 10,000 local fighters, most of them Kachins, in guerrilla warfare. Official reports from the Northern Combat Area Command credited the detachment with killing or wounding nearly 10,000 Japanese soldiers, capturing 75, destroying 51 bridges, derailing 9 trains, and wrecking 277 enemy vehicles. Perhaps even more critical was the rescue of 232 downed American pilots whose planes had crashed during perilous supply flights over the hump into China. The bulk of Allied intelligence in the region also came from Detachment 101. Remarkably, American losses in the unit were minimal compared to the scale of its operations. Only 3 were killed by enemy fire, and 19 lost in plane crashes. In recognition of this unmatched record, the War Department awarded Detachment 101 the Distinguished Unit Citation on January 17, 1946. Years later, on February 8, 1959, Major General William J. Wild Bill Donovan, the founder of the OSS and the mastermind behind these covert operations in Burma, passed away in the United States. His vision had transformed unconventional warfare. Personal memories of those who served or whose families were part of this campaign highlight its lasting legacy. Dr. Carl H. Marauders, a veteran of World War II and later the Korean War, reflected on his time in service from his home in Newport Beach, California. Another contributor remembered his father, William H. McClare, who had served as a liaison pilot with Detachment 101, earning the Air Medal and 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses before joining the newly created CIA, where he later became involved. In the Bay of Pigs operation before his death in 1970, others recounted service by Marines like John Neist, who served with OSS Detachment 101, expressing gratitude to him and to comrades such as Norm Abbott and Bill U. Some sought further information about medical officers attached to the unit, recalling accounts of U.S. Army Captain Dr. Walter Rosen, who tended to wounded flyers in the rugged mountains of Burma. These recollections, woven together with the historical record, demonstrate how the extraordinary story of the OSS guerrillas in Burma continued to be remembered, both for its strategic